Worship is it's a comprehensive concept in Islam. But what is God telling us? He's telling us that the only purpose that we were created for, and there's no other, is to worship God. Now, what does it mean to truly worship God? When we say La ilaha illallah, we're not saying that our God is the only God or our Muslim God. We're saying the God of all people is the only thing worthy of our ultimate love and worship. And so when we give purpose to the next generation, see, because the problem is we live in a society right now that worships a lot of other things. We worship a lot of things in our society. And in fact, we are bombarded with things to worship. And I'm not talking here about Jesus. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about materialism. I'm telling you that we are actually living in a society that teaches us and actually bombards us with the worship of money, with the worship of status, with the worship of power. These are the things we actually worship. We don't worship these religious symbols anymore. This is actually what our children are, and us, are dealing with. That this is the type of worship that we're being told to be involved in. And that is that take your money as your Lord, or take your status as your Lord, or take power. There are a lot of people who worship power. If you look at the crimes that are being committed at the highest level to the lowest level in the world, and you look at why, you'll find that that's what it's about. It's about the worship of power and the worship of money. And so these are objects of worship. Now, how do we come back to our ultimate purpose? Our ultimate purpose is to realize that our being created was for this one purpose, and that is to know, love, worship God. And I think that this is the first goal that I see, and as a litmus test, are we doing our job right in Islamic education? Have we given that higher purpose? It isn't only about learning haram and halal. See, the problem is, I think, that a lot of Islamic education across the board kind of goes wrong in this department, is that we tend, when we come to Islamic studies, we tend to teach Islam as a list of harams and halals, right? As a list of do's and don'ts. It's haram to eat this, it's halal to eat this, it's haram to wear this, and it's halal to wear this. And that's sort of what Islam becomes boiled down to. And that's a big problem, because ultimately, we have to be able to teach our children a higher purpose, to give them perspective. What are they doing here? And then how are they going to be able to live in this materialistic society without worshiping materialism, without worshiping that money? Yes, be doctors. Yes, be lawyers. Yes, be teachers. Have your endeavors in this life, but be careful not to worship it. Because the moment that you worship it, that's when you drown in it. You know, there's this really beautiful analogy. I write about it in my book, Reclaim Your Heart. There's a really beautiful analogy that one of the scholars gave about dunya. Now, what is dunya? And this brings me to my second point of one of the goals of Islamic education. And I think that one of the goals of Islamic education needs to be giving children the tools to master the dunya. To master the dunya. How many people seen The Matrix? Like 2 people? Okay, anyway. Basically, mastering the dunya is realizing that this life, knowing it for what it is, and not allowing it to own you. This is very important. And so the analogy that he gives is that this life is like an ocean. Now, if you think about an ocean, what's the purpose of an ocean? Well, if you're traveling on the ocean, what are you going to use to travel on the ocean? A boat. Great, okay. You guys are awake, right? You use a boat, right? So you use a boat to travel from point A to point B on an ocean. So he gives the analogy that this life, dunya, is like an ocean. Now the thing about an ocean is it's really beautiful from the shore, right? We can appreciate an ocean. It's really beautiful from the boat, right? Yes? But what happens when you allow the ocean to enter the boat? Anyone heard of the Titanic? It sinks. Brilliant. So what he explains is that the believer, or the human being, in fact, in this life is like a person, is like a boat in the ocean. And the boat is like the heart. So the heart in this life is like that boat in the ocean. The problem is, as long as you keep the water outside of the boat, it stays afloat. You feel me? You will be able to survive the ocean and even use the ocean, right? We get food from the ocean. We use the ocean for travel. But the ocean can also swallow you up, can it? If you allow the ocean to enter your boat, in this analogy, it's the heart. If you allow the ocean to enter the boat, that's when it owns the boat, and that's when it breaks the boat, and that's when it can consume the boat and drown the boat. And this is what happens to a human being who allows this life, dunya, materialism, to enter their hearts and take over. So the problem is not having things in the dunya. The problem isn't having money. The problem isn't having power. The problem isn't having status. The problem is when we start to worship these things. The problem is when these things take over our hearts. And when a person allows money, for example, to take over their hearts, it's like a boat that allows the ocean water to enter it. And we all know, as many of you said, what happened to the Titanic, right? It was supposed to be the unsinkable ship. It was supposed to be the greatest ship of its kind, of its time, right? And what happened to it? It went down in history as the ship that got owned by the ocean and drowned. And that's exactly what happens to us when we don't have the right relationship with dunya. When we allow the dunya to enter our hearts and take over. And when our love for dunya is so intense that we actually become slaves to the dunya. So there's a very famous saying of one of the companions. And what he said is, zuhud. Zuhud is a concept of detachment, not being too attached to this life. He said that detachment is not that you do not own anything. It is that nothing owns you. So you may, and there were many companions, they were very wealthy. They had money, but as the scholars say, their money was in their hand, not in their hearts. The problem is when money is in the heart, it poisons the heart. Just like the water of the ocean poisons the ship. And so these are concepts that we have to teach our children because yes, we live in a society that tells us to worship money, that tells us to worship status, to worship materialism.